Hello and welcome to A Bit Too Much to Think, live on KUST Radio. Got an awesome show for this beautiful weekend. At least I hope it's the weekend for those of you out there. If it's not the weekend for you just yet, thank you very much for your service when you're at Taco Bell at 3 a.m. when I'm drunk and hungry. So, I appreciate all of you out there that work on the weekend. But for those of you that don't, it is the weekend. And today, I've got an amazing show. We've got classic rock, our news correspondent, Alege Zones, back by popular opinion, and some opinions and ideas you may not like. So last week, I kind of started off with a bit of case law that I found really interesting, and I want to continue with that, because it's kind of cool to me. And last week, I talked about a case that involved a little bit of more of a pro-free speech argument, which is, it's a free speech argument. You gotta take what you can with it, And for the most part, I'm openly kind of a free speech absolutist, if you will. So, I have trouble believing in the legitimacy of taking away free speech. But I want to talk about a case where free speech actually was kind of limited, because it can be limited very much. And so this case is Chaplinski v. New Hampshire from 1942. So a man, Mr. Chaplinski, he was a Jehovah's Witness who was preaching and selling pamphlets in public space. And he was talking against organized religion. And it actually bothered a lot of people, so they got a mob, kind of what he was saying, caused a mob to come after him. One person started to attack him, and then others joined in, and eventually a policeman handcuffed him, Mr. Chaplinski. And so the man, Mr. Chaplinski, asked, why are you arresting me and not the people that are trying to attack me, the crazy mob? And the officer just told him to shut up, and Chaplinski then insulted him. What resulted was Chaplinski having to spend time in jail and pay a fine because verbally insulting a police officer is against the law in New Hampshire. At least it was in 1942, and probably still is. And so it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Justice Murphy is the one who wrote the final decision. And what they decided on, the majority decision, was that Mr. Chaplinski's free speech was not being impeded by this law because, I'll read the actual decision. It's kind of interesting. So they weren't saying that he wasn't allowed to, let me just be clear about this. They weren't saying, the law was not saying he was breaking the law for speaking about religion or like preaching on the street corner. That wasn't the law. The fact that he insulted the police officer is actually what the law that he broke, technically. And so what the justice said is that fighting words, which is what that's the exact quote, which makes me think of Bugs Bunny. But the fighting words, according to Justice Murphy, are not an exposition of idea or ideas, and that basically they have no social value as a step to truth. And as a result, any benefit is outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. There's a couple of quotes directly from the decision. So the basic idea is the fact that, he insulted a police officer, and, he was swearing at him, and he was, basically saying fighting words, things that are designed to cause a little stir. And what the ruling really says is that those laws that say that those are against the law are not a violation of the First Amendment, because the core of the First Amendment is to protect the ability of a person to express ideas, especially if it's in terms of like religious ideas or ideas contrary to the government's plans, or things like that. Being able to be openly against the government is basically the core of it. And just saying F you to the police officer, calling him, I believe, well, I'm not allowed to say the words that he said on air. You can Google it. But he basically just called him offensive names, and that's not an expression of ideas. And I don't think that's exactly a controversial opinion. We all know that that's, not an expression of a real idea. So as a result, Chaplinski had to pay the fine and go to jail, and the law in New Hampshire that outlawed insulting police officers was upheld. Now, if here's where the difference lies, is it's very specific in the decision that it's just fighting words that have no social value as a step to truth are what are not protected by the First Amendment. So if you were to say, the Black Lives Matter movement does this a lot, where they say, all police are pigs because, we believe that they target black people. That's allowed. I personally disagree with it. I don't think statistics agree with it, but that's completely allowed. That's protected by the First Amendment. But if you were to just say all policemen are pigs, they're all just terrible people, and that causes a stir, a lack of, as Justice Murphy puts it, social order, then you can be arrested for that. Or, well, let me rephrase that. Not every place has a law against that. The idea is that states can outlaw that kind of speech. If it's just straight up insults at a person, you're allowed to outlaw it. So that's kind of interesting, because you think of free speech as like, everyone says you can't, the limit to free speech is you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. And really, the idea behind that is you can't cause a major infraction on social order and morality, exactly as Justice Murphy put it. So that's kind of the idea behind it, is if you're not expressing an idea, and especially if it's like a political one or one critical of a certain opinion, then you technically don't always have the right to say it, depending on federal law and local state law and state statutes and stuff like that. Now, it could be that a state allows all kinds of speech like that as well, which is fine. But the main idea is states that have laws against that kind of speech, like just straight up insults, those laws aren't unconstitutional. That's the idea behind it. And it's interesting to think about limits on free speech because, last week I just kind of said free speech should be absolute, barring some exceptions. And this is one of those exceptions that I think is important to talk about, because it's not really worth it to me to just allow anyone to say anything. You have to allow people to say bad opinions as long as they are, as Justice Murphy puts it, a step to truth, or an exposition of ideas. Even if we know that the truth isn't right, like denying the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide or something like that, it's still an exposition of ideas, and that's protected. But just straight up saying, go take a toaster bath, that's not really protected by the First Amendment, and there could be laws against that. There's not always, but there could be. So it was just kind of interesting. Talked about that in class. I really like talking about things that I learn in class on here because, let's be honest, like I always say, you never use most of what you learn in class, especially if you learn Latin. All right, so slightly inside joke aside, we are going to go ahead and take our first break. We are going to be listening to some classic rock as always. This is one of my personal favorites. This song is Baba O'Reilly by The Who. Hi, this is Sam with A Bit Too Much to Think. Unfortunately, due to copyright reasons, we cannot upload the music to YouTube. So if you'd like to listen to it and get the full experience, listen to us live 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. on Fridays on Radio KUST on Mixlr. That's mixlr.com/KUST-radio. Thanks for listening. All right, welcome back. That was Baba O'Reilly by The Who. I have no idea who Baba O'Reilly is or why they named it that. I'm sure there's a reason. I just don't know what it is. It's an interesting name, just like a name that I learned of back in elementary or middle school. Theodoric the Ostrogoth. That was a famous man of the Middle Ages. So, yeah, learned about that one. Interesting names. Speaking of interesting names, this name always gets an interesting reaction. Donald Trump recently signed into law an act called the Save Our Seas Act of 2018, and I want to talk about it today. Mostly because I think it's counter to what the narrative tends to be about Donald Trump. Because I think that there's this big narrative, and I don't think most people disagree, that whenever you put on the news, you inevitably hear about how, he's a climate change denier, or that he, appointed a climate change denier to the head of the EPA. Or at least that when he appointed that head, that was certainly something that people were talking about. And that, the world is just going to go to hell. It's just going to be terrible. We're not going to be able to breathe soon. We're going to run out of clean water and clean oxygen. And I don't know, things are going pretty well. I mean, I don't think people would disagree. I mean, you can, unless you're in Flint, Michigan, you can turn on your tap and drink from it, probably. So you can also breathe, because I can do that right now. So I'd hope you're able to. Anyway, so I want to talk about the Save Our Seas Act of 2018, because I think it's really interesting. You can look it up at congress.gov. More people need to look up stuff from congress.gov. You should actually read the legislation that's going out. I think that's important. But I'm going to talk to you about the Save Our Seas Act. And so I have an article here from whitehouse.gov where it's quoting Donald Trump saying, talking about it. So I'm going to do my best to do a Trump impression for a brief moment. So he says, every year, over 8 million tons of garbage is dumped into our beautiful oceans. And when you think of that number, I mean, to think 8 million tons. And I would say it's probably, senators, I think it's probably more than that, based on what we've seen, on the kind of work that I've seen being done. All right, I'm done with that impression. But anyway, so that's a direct quote from him. And so basically he says, this dumping has been happening for years and even for decades. Previous administrations did absolutely nothing to take on the foreign countries responsible. We've already notified most of them, and we notified them very strongly. The Save Our Seas Act will help address this problem by extending the marine debris program for 5 additional years. That's a program that was designed to, I believe it was used the Coast Guard to clean up literally marine debris, like debris in the ocean. He says we are also strengthening that up to improve waste management overseas and clean up our nation's water. We will boost the federal government's response to ocean waste by authorizing the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to declare severe marine debris events, which happen all the time. It's incredible. It's incredible when you look at it. People don't realize it, but all the time we're being inundated by debris from other countries. This legislation will release funds to states for cleanup and for response efforts, and we will be responding very strongly. So, the idea behind this legislation is massive amounts of marine debris and literally just pure pollution. I believe the majority of it is coming from India and China right now. They're dumping it into the rivers or whatever. The rivers are flowing into our seas, and then it's creating massive garbage, literally like garbage islands, much like the UK, but actual garbage, not just bad people. I'm just kidding. Anyway, it's creating like massive islands of garbage just sitting in the middle of the ocean. And I'm glad to see that Trump is actually stepping up the foreign policy response. It's kind of different from what he did with the Paris Accords, but the Paris Accords were also terrible. And I think this is a much better way to look at least marine debris to try to curtail it. And I think that, again, it goes against the narrative of Donald Trump as this horrible, he's a climate change denier. He's an idiot. And this is actually a really smart act. I mean, this helps clean up massive amounts of pollution that straight up should not be there. I don't think anyone would argue that we should be throwing trash into the ocean. At least I'd hope you wouldn't. But yeah, it's a really cool legislation. You should look it up. You can find it at congress.gov. If you just Google Save Our Seas Act of 2018, you'll find it. And yeah, and I think this is I think his foreign policy aspect of it is important because, look, the U.S. and Western Europe can work as hard as we can to decrease our carbon footprint, but everything that we do to decrease it is ruined 100-fold by China and India right now because they're massively industrializing, which isn't a bad thing, but their industrialization is causing a ton of pollution, just horrifying amounts of pollution. And China and India are doing nothing about it. And so for Trump to kind of take this stance of, look, like this is almost a foreign policy problem as much as it is a problem for the individual, for the country, climate change, and not even just getting into climate change, but generally just like pollution is a problem that is being exacerbated by China and India right now. They're causing horrifying amounts of pollution. So it's something that we need to take care of, need to look into, as much as, going towards cleaner forms of energy, which for some reason nuclear energy is never in that conversation, which it needs to be because it's literally the cleanest form of energy. And everyone would know that's true if they just looked at facts, but everyone hears nuclear. They think of George W. Bush, and they don't like it. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting perspective to think about pollution as a foreign policy issue if you want to decrease it, because it is. Because again, we can, decrease our carbon footprint by tiny percents every year, and we're already super low on our carbon footprint on the pollution that we emit. But unless some other countries that are polluting like thousands of times what the U.S. is doing are going to cut down their emissions, it's not going to change anything. You're tossing water droplets into the tub while the drain is open. I mean, that's basically what you're doing here. You're trying to keep the tub full, and you're tossing in, single drops. Meanwhile, China and India are pulling the plug on that tub and just emptying it. So I think it's a good idea to at least consider pollution from a foreign policy perspective. If there's one thing that Trump has been doing that I think is right, it's our foreign policy. I don't really care if Angela Merkel doesn't like us. I don't really care if citizens in the UK don't really like us. We beat the first country in 2 world wars and bailed the other country out of 2. So honestly, they owe us a lot. All right, so switching over to a different country. Staying here, I guess, in North America. Canada just legalized marijuana. Can you hear that? It's all the Christian right screaming in pain. Nah. So Canada legalized marijuana for recreational use. They're considering to offer pardons for minor pot convictions. Now here's the thing about marijuana. I don't mess with the devil's lettuce. I think it's kind of dumb to do. But I don't think it's necessarily wrong to legalize. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to legalize any drug, but especially not marijuana, because, look, as long as people know the possible negative effects, and as long as we make it clear that the guys that are like, oh, well, pot helps everything. Pot can cure cancer. Pot, it cured my asthma instead of making it worse. Like, as long as we ignore that kind of stupid stuff, I don't think it's wrong. And as long as people have all the information necessary, like pot can cause this, it can cause this, you shouldn't drive while you're high, things like that. I don't see a real objective reason as to why not, other than people just saying, but it's a drug. So is ibuprofen. So is acetaminophen. So is even prescription strength stuff, like prescription antibiotics are technically drugs. Prescription strength painkillers are technically drugs, and those are being abused massively, and that's another kind of side of it. But just the fact that it is a drug that alters your state of mind isn't really a big deal. So is alcohol. Right now, I can go to the liquor store and buy like $200 of alcohol as long as I have the money and I was born before this day in 1997. It's not a big deal. So I don't see a real good argument for why it should be criminalized the way that it is. So I think that Canada probably made the right call here, legalizing it for recreational use. I think it's going to decrease general crime. I think that the free market is going to make it cheaper, which means that cartels won't have the incentive to sell it anymore, which decreases gang money and stuff like that, which I think is very, very good. So I think it could actually help crime instead of harm it. But really, we'll see. I mean, this is kind of a thing where no other country similar to Canada has done this. And we've had it legalized for recreational use in certain states in the U.S., but those states, the problem is that if you don't do it in the entire country, the specific areas where it's legalized can become really seedy really fast because a lot of a lot of less than ideal people come to that area to just get high all the time and not have to worry about the cops. On the bright side, Domino's Pizza in Canada is doing exceedingly well because you got to be high to eat that garbage. No, so yeah, it's kind of an interesting conversation about the legalization of drugs, and as a more libertarian-leaning person, I'd definitely say that the legalization of marijuana needs to happen in the U.S. Quite frankly, the war on drugs really doesn't work. It never did. It's a waste of money and a waste of our time, and it's really just filling our prison system. And we can at least start with a drug that most people agree is not necessarily... It's not good for you, I mean, obviously, but it's not like you're taking heroin either. I'd compare it to alcohol, really. Yeah, I'd compare it to alcohol. Alcohol. They usually say alcohol affects your body, marijuana affects your mind, and that's kind of the way it is. And yeah, I don't see why that should be illegal. I really don't. One thing that I do want to see from Canada about this is whether or not crime actually goes up, or see, because crime is going to go down in terms of like drug convictions because you just have a whole drug that's not a crime anymore. So obviously crime is going to go down, but I want to see if other crime related to other drugs is going to go down as well, because there's less of an incentive for people to be dealing drugs in those areas, because one of the drugs you can just literally just go down to like the place next in between Walgreens and Jimmy John's and just grab some Pineapple Express and then get some Jimmy John's because you have the munchies. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Be interesting to see what happens. It's a bit of an experiment right now, but I think if it goes well, I really struggle to see why it's not going to become more of a, at least in the U.S., I struggle to see why it wouldn't become more of a states' rights kind of thing. Like, if a state wants to legalize it, they can. If they don't want to legalize it, I don't know why they wouldn't want to, but if they don't want to, they don't have to. But I think it should be legal on terms of a federal level. I think Jeff Sessions is a little outdated in his view that marijuana is a terrible drug. It's again, I don't mess with this stuff, but look, like I'm in college. I know people that do it, and as much as the people that do it all the time tend to be really dumb, I don't see why it should really be illegal. I really don't. And you might know people in your personal life that, maybe they got addicted to it, which that absolutely does happen. Like, there comes a point where you're addicted. But, realize that that's one person and not a majority of people. And, I just really don't think that marijuana is that bad of a drug based on, studies that have shown how it affects us. Personal encounters with people that were high where I sold them pizza. That was pretty cool. Yeah, that's a true story, actually. I was walking home at, it was like midnight. I was walking back on my campus with like half a Domino's pizza. Some people were like, "Oh, dude, you have pizza," and their eyes were completely red, and they smelled like weed. And I was like, "Yeah, I'll sell it to you guys. How's $3 a slice?" They were like, "Yeah, man." So they bought like $10 worth of pizza from me. It was great. Yeah. Well, anyway, aside from my monetary gains from marijuana. That's another thing is the U.S. can just tax the crap out of marijuana, just like they do with tobacco, and get massive amounts of money. I really don't see how that's a problem. All right, so enough of me blathering on about weed. Let's go back to some music. This next one is, let's see, I think I played this on my first show 2 weeks ago, but I do love it very much. It's from my favorite album, Back in Black. This song is You Shook Me All Night Long by AC/DC. Hi, this is Sam with A Bit Too Much to Think. Unfortunately, due to copyright reasons, we cannot upload the music to YouTube. So if you'd like to listen to it and get the full experience, listen to us live 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. on Fridays on Radio KUST on Mixlr. That's mixlr.com/KUST-radio. Thanks for listening. Welcome back to A Bit Too Much to Think live on KUST Radio. That song was You Shook Me All Night Long by AC/DC. So right now we have a very special guest that I love having on the show because he works for the price of 2 Twinkies. Mr. Alij Zones. He's our news correspondent, and he has got something very interesting for all of us, I'm told. I really hope it's coherent because most of it isn't, but I guess we'll find out. Mr. Zones, you are live on KUST Radio.
Well, hey, Sam. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem, Mr. Zones. I hear you've got something special for us.
Yeah, that's right. I sure do. Now, listen. Here's the thing, folks. I have got from one of my operatives within the shadow government that this is a document. All right, this is real, folks. This is happening. I have got a document that says that Gatorade actually does not contain any gator.
What, Mr. Zones? Gatorade, the drink?
Yep. Best flavor is lemon lime. We all know it. But apparently, its title is misleading, and it contains absolutely no gator in it. No alligator at all.
I don't think there was ever an implication that there was alligator in Gatorade.
Well, then why is it called Gatorade, Sam? Why is that? Can you riddle me that one? 'Cause I want to know. Why is it called Gatorade if there's no gator in it?
Well, I do remember a commercial from when I was a kid that had, they said that they made it for the Florida Gators or something like that, the college football team.
Yep, no, I don't think that's right. That's just what the shadow government wants you to believe.
I'm not sure how to feel about this one.
Well, you should feel pretty mad, 'cause here's the deal, Sam. Gatorade contains no actual gator, which makes me wonder, what's actually in it? Is it chemicals? 'Cause I guarantee it's some kind of chemical.
Well, I mean, everything's made of chemicals, right?
Nah, and this stuff. This stuff has special chemicals, probably the mind control like the fluoride in our water. It's trying to turn us all into dang communists.
Mr. Zones, have you been to Canada recently? Are you doing okay? Are you on the devil's lettuce?
Nope, I never touched that stuff in my life. I'm just a simple supplement salesman, all right? And I'm trying to tell you that Gatorade contains no gator, so what's in it? It's got to be some kind of evil mind control by the shadow government, Sam.
I don't know if that's entirely true. Why are you making wild speculations?
'Cause that's my job.
I think your job is to be our news correspondent.
No, it ain't. It's to be the man that tells you how it is and then speculates about it. Now look, they mislead you with the name Gatorade, implying that there's some kind of gator. Now what kind of people would want to drink gator? Real Americans, Sam. They're trying to fight against America. I think this might be a Russian conspiracy.
I'm not sure where to go with that one. Russian conspiracy is Gatorade. That must be why it mixes so well with vodka.
See? Right there. Another reason. They made it to mix with vodka to get us Americans hooked on their potato water instead of hooked on our beautiful, amazing beer that we make here.
Oh, like Hams.
Not Coors Light.
I disagree with you entirely. Coors Light is not that good, dude.
All right. We're getting off topic here.
How are you the one that's putting me back on topic? Well, anyway, Mr. Zones, I appreciate you for trying to bring this to the public eye. You really did your best, and that's all I can ever ask of you. But unfortunately, I remain unconvinced that people believe that Gatorade was made of gator. Did you really believe that?
Yeah. Is that weird?
A little bit, yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on here, Mr. Zones.
Well, thanks for having me on here. I really appreciate it.
All right. That was Mr. Alige Zones. If only his parents had named him Alex like a normal parent. He tries, and he works for cheap, and he's the only news correspondent we can get on here, so we love him dearly. Up next, we have our commercial break. So not our music break, but our commercial break. Take it away. Hi, this is Sam with A Bit Too Much to Think, live on KUST Radio. You may be thinking to yourself, why are you advertising for yourself? Well, that's because we don't have any sponsors. So if anyone out there would be interested in sponsoring A Bit Too Much to Think live on KUST Radio, especially if it's a beer company, Hams, talking to you, Michelob Golden Light, talking to you. If any of you would be interested in sponsoring me, all it would take is like a 6-pack a week, and I will talk up your beer all you want. Coors need not apply. All right, welcome back from our commercial break. The very last kind of news portion and kind of current events portion that I want to talk about is from the BBC News. There was recently some new insight into the history of dogs and humans. Now, this is where I like to talk about the more wholesome news going on in our world, and dogs are very wholesome indeed. I love dogs so much. So, it looks like, according to this article from the BBC, its title is A Long Walk, New Insight into History of Humans and Dogs. Sorry, Dogs and Humans. So it says, dogs were a key part of a key moment in human history when our ancestors began trying their hand at farming. So it says, as the first farmers moved out of the Middle East, herding animals such as sheep and goats, dogs tagged along too, say scientists. Humans who were living as hunter-gatherers settled down and started growing wild varieties of crops, like wheat, barley, peas, and lentils. They also domesticated animals from wild sheep, cows, and pigs. About 9,000 years ago, they moved into Europe and Asia, taking their animals and farming know-how with them. A new study shows that dogs also went on the trip. So it's just kind of interesting that dogs basically have been with humans since they started farming, which kind of makes sense because, you have these herding dogs for herds of sheep and stuff. You have dogs that are very good at defending herds, and I think that it's just kind of interesting how the domestication process took place, and I think it's wholesome to know that dogs have loved us so much that they're still with us, even for the past, 11, what did it say, 9,000 years ago? Yeah, I think 9,000 years ago. Yeah, so for about 9,000 years, dogs have been man's best friend. I love dogs so much. So yeah, that's a little bit of wholesome news. They realized that dogs have been with humans for a really long time. One thing that's kind of interesting is that, where is it? Oh, so dogs evolved from wolves about 20 to 40,000 years ago when they were tamed by hunter-gatherers. But they actually might have been tamed from two different populations of wolves living thousands of miles apart. And then when the dogs from, where did they say, the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, when the farmers started moving from the Fertile Crescent to Europe, it actually shows that the dogs from the Fertile Crescent mixed with the dogs that were already in Europe, and actually helped change the gene pool, which is kind of cool. yeah, so it's very interesting. This article closes with modern dogs of all shapes and sizes are very different now to those early farm dogs who accompanied their owners on their travels. Centuries of dog breeding have mixed up the genes of dogs further. Yeah, it's kind of interesting and very wholesome. Puts a little smile on my face thinking about those dogs 9,000 years ago. All right, so we're gonna listen to a couple songs here. I've actually got two queued up because one of them's super short. The first one is "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival, and the last one is "Sweet Home Alabama" by Leonard Skinner. Hi, this is Sam with A Bit Too Much to Think. Unfortunately, due to copyright reasons, we cannot upload the music to YouTube. So if you'd like to listen to it and get the full experience, listen to us live 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. on Fridays on Radio KUST on Mixlr. That's mixlr.com/KUST-radio. Thanks for listening. All right, welcome back to A Bit Too Much to Think live on KUST Radio on Mixlr. So that was, what were those? "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival and "Sweet Home Alabama" by Leonard Skinner. Again, two absolutely classic rock songs, and two of my personal favorites. So the very last part that I want to do before I take it away with a little bit of music and send you guys off is I want to talk about, so last week I talked about this guy, John Rawls, who wrote this book, A Theory of Justice, and in it, he kind of described his idea of a just society being a fair society, and that if you were to take everyone behind what he referred to as a veil of ignorance, and you were to ask, and so the veil of ignorance is they know they're going to be in this society, they have no idea what their class is going to be, what their life is going to be like, what the society is going to be like, what would they agree on, and I think it's kind of an interesting idea because what everyone would agree on is kind of, let's be honest, it'd be difficult to agree on anything. And so he felt that what everyone would agree on is everything being as fair as possible, and that there be some sort of government structure that would ensure everything being fair, including those with more helping those with less and things like that. And so, kind of in the opposite line is this book that I want to talk about today by Robert Nozick. It's called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It's known for being one of the biggest, libertarian, I guess, pieces of literature out there. And yes, that's one of the, well, I was already a libertarian by the time I read it, but I enjoyed reading it anyway. But it's kind of an interesting book because it looks at government not as ensuring a fair outcome, but ensuring that government protects life, liberty, property, and contract are the four things that he lists. And so he obviously takes that a little bit from John Locke. And in the Declaration of Independence, we've all heard, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They took that from John Locke. I believe it's in his second treatise of government, where he describes life, liberty, and property are kind of the rights of man, if you will. And so Nozick adds contract to that, because what he's saying is that the government should ensure that agreements legally set into become have their legal outcome. So that's kind of the idea behind that. But it's very interesting because he says that the only legitimate state is what he describes as a minimal state, that basically government should only have to intercede where necessary, and beyond that, the government should basically just stay out of things, which I don't think is a position that a lot of people disagree with. I think that a lot of people, they want to make their own decisions for themselves. They kind of want to stop people from, they don't want other people bothering them. They don't want these bureaucrats bothering them. They just want to live their lives, make their own decisions, and, and have the necessary, infrastructure there. So, obviously you need roads and stuff. You need police, you need, firemen and stuff like that. But beyond that, so that's kind of the idea. That I think that that's the idea that I think most people would not disagree with is, just leave me alone and let me live my life. It's very much a libertarian idea, but I don't think most people disagree with it. I think that everyone, when they got their first paycheck and saw how much was taken out for taxes, they instantly became a little bit libertarian. So that's kind of where I want to, like, if the Libertarian Party really wanted to succeed, what they really should do is find out from every, like, company when when someone gets their first paycheck, and in the mail with their first paycheck, with all those taxes, you put in a brochure that says, hate taxes, vote Libertarian Party. They would win the next election. I guarantee it. The next, in like 2 years, when all those kids turn 18, they would win instantly. Anyway, so going back to Anarchy State and Utopia, kind of getting off on a tangent. The main idea behind it is, it's an interesting one that a couple different people have taken a swing at, is going from the state of nature, which is kind of without government, without society, kind of man in his natural habitat. And basically the idea is that people enter into agreed upon contracts and societies primarily for protection, because, when you're in a state of nature, there are no laws, there are no rules. You have stuff, and that other guy has stuff, and if you hit him over the head with a rock, you get to take his stuff, so it's beneficial to do that. But you're scared that someone might hit you over the head with a rock because you can't always defend yourself when you're sleeping. So you go to another guy and you say, hey, I'll protect you when you're sleeping if you protect me when I'm sleeping. And it's like, sure. And then they kind of, they have their own stuff, but they watch out for each other. And then, that kind of system grows and grows until eventually you have like a fully formed society. And that's a very quick version. That's like the quickest and dirtiest version of the state of nature that we could find. But that's the main idea, is from a state of nature, it really emerges for a need for protection, and that's why you enter into these contracts that confine you. Because, in a state of nature, if there are no laws, you could bash the guy you're protecting over the head with a rock, but then he doesn't protect you. And so that's kind of the idea, is there's this agreed upon limitation of liberty. Well, not even liberty, just agreed upon limitation of action, which is, I don't bash you over the head with a rock, you don't bash me over the head with a rock. And then it's like, all right, we both live and we defend each other. And from there, it develops into a fully fledged society. And I'm doing the short version of that idea. But, so limitations on action come from agreements that are mutually beneficial. So, for example, getting taxed to pay for a police force, that's not necessarily something that's outside the norm or outside of acceptability, because it is protecting all of us. And that's kind of where the idea comes from, is what is it something that everyone, it is kind of talking about like what's something everyone could agree upon, just like John Rawls does, but it's more focused on the ideas behind them rather than the outcome. And Rawls, I think, focuses a lot more on the outcome. And Nozick focuses kind of on the principle of, is everyone having equal opportunity and protection? Are they having their life, liberty, property, and contracts? And beyond that, it's not necessarily within the government's purview to really take care of people. And obviously there's stuff, there's things beyond that, like a small social safety net I don't think is out of the question, and I don't think it's inconsistent with Nozick, but it's an interesting idea. So that's kind of the thing to think about. Should the government be more concerned with outcome, like John Rawls talks about, or more concerned with protecting you in an agreed-upon contract that you have entered into? Should the government protect your life, liberty, property, and contracts, or be more concerned with what the outcome is for everyone? I would argue the first one, but if you think that the second one is legitimate, it certainly is. Rawls is an absolutely genius political scientist. So this wraps up a bit too much to think on this lovely Friday afternoon. I hope to have you all back next week. Thank you so much for listening. We are going to exit with Back in Black by AC/DC. Thank you so much for listening. Hi, this is Sam with A Bit Too Much to Think. Unfortunately, due to copyright reasons, we cannot upload the music to YouTube. So if you'd like to listen to it and get the full experience, listen to us live 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. on Fridays on Radio KUST on Mixlr. That's mixlr.com/KUST-radio. Thanks for listening.